I think the Raymond Bonner story is a bit like the missing link between what happened in the 70s when the Washington Post and the New York Times are still living on that sort of heyday of being tough journalists. They were willing to stand up to Nixon ultimately. And some of that continued on through the 70s, where there was more of a skeptical approach by the major news media toward government and power. And then that really changes at the very beginning of the Reagan years. Reagan was well liked by a lot of people in the news business. Catherine Graham, who I later worked for when she owned Newsweek at the time I was there, she liked the Reagans. She really loved them. They were like Hollywood royalty, and that was quite impressive to her. So you started seeing this shift, and plus there was a lot of a backlash, if you will, against the 60s and 70s. There was a cultural backlash by some of the people who were older, who were publishers, who were running news organizations. They were more from the World War II generation, and they'd never liked what happened in the 60s. They didn't like the fact that the young people were more unwilling to be shipped off to a war. So there was a lot of that sort of generational kind of cultural hostility toward what had been happening in journalism in that period. And so you get into the 80s, and the Reagan people were extremely sophisticated in how they approached controlling the message, controlling the media. We now know the documents that you can find at the Reagan Library, some new ones I just actually got a few weeks ago, show that there were there were multi-agencies that were brought in to the National Security Council, and they worked together on how to do what they call perception management. They realized that what was really needed was to at some point get the American people back in line, because the American people were kind of out of control in the 70s. There was not just the anti-war demonstrations, but there was this tremendous distrust of what the government was saying, feelings that the CIA had gotten out of control, and that the American people wanted to know more and wanted to be more resistant to some of this behavior. So there was a strategy put together in the early 1980s to whip the American press corps back into line and to gradually bring the American people more into line as well, so there would not be resistance to future military operations abroad. They called it kicking the Vietnam syndrome. That was the phrase they used. They needed to figure out ways to get the American people to, quote, kick the Vietnam syndrome. And so Ray Bonner was, at that time, a reporter for the New York Times in Central America, and he was reporting courageously and accurately on the death squad operations that the U.S.-backed regimes were carrying out there. This was like a Holocaust in Central America. There was, of course, the Guatemalan intelligence services. They were slaughtering people in Guatemala. It even reached the point of genocide, according to one of the human rights investigations later. In El Salvador, the military-backed government there was taking people out in the streets and murdering them quite regularly, including American church women who were raped and then murdered, and just before Reagan took office. And there was a real targeting especially of the Catholic priests who were promoting social justice in the region. So Bonner was covering this and reporting about these death squad operations, and it was something that the Reagan people wanted to suppress. They did not want those stories out because it was hard to get the American people in Congress to go along with sending weapons to these different governments if they were known to be complicit in these horrible atrocities. So Raymond Bonner had to be taken out, and he did a very important story of a massacre that occurred at a town called El Mozote, where several hundred, possibly as many as 1,000 men, women, and children were taken out and butchered by the Salvadoran military, the Atlacat Battalion, which was the first of the Salvadoran battalions trained by the U.S. military. And and they were basically doing an extermination campaign in areas that were considered pro-rebel, pro-guerrilla. Similar things were going on in Guatemala. This all had to be suppressed. So the way to do it was to discredit the journalists who were writing the stories, and so Bonner came under heavy attack.
Bonner's front page in the New York Times on the El Mozote massacre. It came out one day before the Reagan administration certified that El Salvador had passed, that they'd improved their human rights record, that they had the army under control, right, and that was needed to get more money to give them arms and training, right? So,
right, and even and some of the people that we now know more about, we would now call them the neoconservatives. They were important players in this phase. Elliot Abrams, who was then the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin American Affairs, was one of the people going up to give testimony on how the Salvadoran military was respectful of human rights. So you had the beginnings of this, what they call perception management. They were trying to control the perceptions of the American people. So they had to then shut down those honest, courageous journalists who were out in the field, on the scene, reporting truthfully. And Bonner became a key target. At the time, there also were a lot of the right-wing media was not what we know of it today, but you were starting to see, like, the Washington Times was going. There were anti-media attack groups like Accuracy in Media.
And if I recall, the young Bill O'Reilly claimed to have been at El Mozote, but he didn't see anything. He mentions that in one of his memoirs, and I checked it out, and he never reported a word about it.
Right, and ultimately it was all confirmed. By the way, the UN went in, and it's amazing that it was kept in doubt for so long. But at the end of the war, I think sort of early 1990s, almost a decade later, the UN went in and dug up the skeletons, including the skeletons of children. There were the kids were sort of locked in a building, and they were burned alive by the Cat Battalion. So it was a very grisly situation. But the key role for the right-wing press, they were trying to protect Reagan's flanks, was to claim it didn't happen and to attack the journalists who reported on it. And ultimately, Abe Rosenthal, who was the executive editor of the New York Times at that point, summons Bonner back to New York and sticks him in some corner office doing some business kind of stuff. And
which is a way of discrediting him. I mean,
basically discrediting him, making it appear that he's been taken back because he's a failed journalist.
Yeah.
And Bonner then resigns from the New York Times.
I mean, that's for people who don't know or aren't maybe in the profession. If that is really the same thing as saying, as the New York Times essentially acknowledging that the Reagan administration was right, that Bonner had made it up, or that he was too sympathetic to the communists, which was what they were claiming about him. Right? I think the Wall Street Journal had posted a huge editorial attacking him as basically a communist dupe. And so when you recall him like that, I mean, Bonner can't even argue it anymore because people would say, well, even your own newspaper, brought you back in. You've no credibility anymore.
Right. The idea that your own newspaper is going to back you up is one of the great myths of journalism.
Yes.
We've seen over and over again. Often, in the case, also, if you go a later case, very similar case is the case of that we've talked about, in terms of various, the news organizations often will tell you that your editors will say, we don't want to really go that direction with you. They're under corporate pressure too. They have their bosses. Gary Webb, for instance, was betrayed by the San Jose Mercury News editor, who was under pressure from Knight Ridder, the parent corporation, because Knight Ridder was reading all this stuff in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the LA Times trashing Webb, and they chose to believe that over Webb. So then they put pressure on Webb's editors, and they folded because they needed to protect their own careers.
Right.
So the idea that you're going to have this sort of Lou Grant kind of editor who's going to be tough and crusty and stand behind his people. It's kind of a myth.
It's one of these cultural myths that, and everybody's still working off Watergate, as if that's the rule rather than the exception, especially the media, the way the media kind of portrays itself as this great principled protectors of us. I mean, it would be worse without them. There's no doubt, but they're so complicit so often. It's there's another story you retell in one of your earlier books, Lost History, Contra's Cocaine, the Press, and Project Truth. And this is something else. Project Truth was another thing that the Reagan administration launched. It was very similar to the hysteria today about Kremlin disinformation, Kremlin active measures, subverting American democracy. Reagan's answer was Project Truth, and to fact check Soviet propaganda and all this stuff. But you write also in the book about how NPR, which is not known as as sort of the wildest muckraking operation out there. NPR came under heavy fire from Reagan people, from Otto Reich, who headed up the Office of Public Diplomacy. I think it was a new office. Public diplomacy is basically another term, one of those dull Washington terms for perception management. And so they ran one of their radio segments from the point of view of Nicaraguan villagers who were massacred, and didn't let didn't give enough voice to the Contras who massacred them. I don't know. And Reich called up screaming at, I think it was a foreign editor, Paul Allen, if I remember right, from your book, and saying, this was one-sided and this is communist propaganda, and I demand a meeting with you. And he comes to the office, NPR office, and he's got some little henchman next to him who actually reads out the number of minutes NPR has devoted to anti-Contra viewpoints, and starts screaming at him, berating him, and Paul Allen winds up getting forced out, and he's out of a job and out of journalism within a year.
Yeah, that's how they had teams. They had teams of people they would send around to your editors to try to badmouth you, and the editors often were intimidated. They were these important people from the State Department would come over, and they'd pound their fists and offer those kinds of criticisms, and the editors usually just didn't want to be bothered, and or they'd be frightened, or they, in a case like Paul Allen did actually support his people, defended their reporting, which was a good story, and but then the higher up at NPR got rid of him. So if your editors do back you up, they may well end up on the street too. Well, right. That's the reality. But one of the interesting people that came out of that that operation that Otto Reich ran was Robert Kagan.
Right. That's
Robert
right.
Kagan was actually replaced Otto Reich. He was another one of the young neocons. There was an entire generation of young neocons that were getting credentialed at that time. So you had Elliot Abrams, you had one of his proteges, Robert Kagan, who then is running this public diplomacy office after Reich leaves. And they learned the tools of the trade. And the tools of the trade were actually being taught to them by a guy named Walter Raymond, who had been the top person in CIA covert operations. And he was moved from the CIA. He was a specialist in propaganda, and he was moved from the CIA to the National Security Council to work on the staff there. And he organized these multi-agency, interagency task forces to develop techniques for doing the propaganda, getting control of the American public, getting control of the media. And they used the techniques that had been developed by the CIA in dealing with hostile countries, and they just applied them domestically. And of course, the CIA is not supposed to be allowed to do that. But by taking the CIA guy and putting him at the National Security Council, they felt they got around that.
Didn't he formally resign from the CIA?
He did resign, but he was there for a while as CIA. But
okay.
The point was, it's kind of a.
It doesn't matter. I'm just saying.
Relevant point because whether you're technically CIA or you're just former CIA teaching the same techniques, it amounts to the same thing.
Of course. Yeah.
But that's how they sort of technically got around it. They did something very similar with the Contra program. They The CIA was forbidden from helping the Contras by Congress at one point. So they just moved things over to the National Security Council under Ollie North. So the same MO was being used in terms of their propaganda system as it was with actually getting arms to the Contras.
So again, that was Robert Parry, and the last name I should remind readers again, it's Parry, and the site is Consortium News, consortiumnews.com, and you'll find a whole huge body of work going back, as he said, 20 years, and he really has the goods on all these stories and a lot of lost history, which was like we live with the consequences of it, even though we don't know where the hell it comes from. It seems like everything's starting back with Nixon's, treasonous deal in South Vietnam up through today.